Hey everybody, welcome to week 13. And if you're paying attention on the calendar, which I know you are, you know that we're coming to the end of the semester. Time does fly. Let me get right to this because there's a couple of other things that I want you to do this week that I posted on Canvas. I'm going to describe those briefly in the context of this lecture. Okay, so here is where we're at logistically in the class. As I alluded to, we're in week 13. Next week, week 14, there is no discussion board. Let me get to that in a second. But weeks 14 and 15 are designed to work together. What that means is go down about 2 bullets. The wrap up for week 14 and 15, as far as you're concerned, is going to be the final journal, your Unit 4 journal. That's going to be due on April 21st. There is no graded discussion for week 14. But I am posting, I should say, an optional discussion where I ask you for suggestions for course improvement. So don't get confused here. This is not your official and anonymous course evaluation, which the university prompts you to fill out. And by the way, those course evals are anonymous. Instructors don't even see the results of those for probably about 6 weeks after the semester is completed. So the week 14 optional discussion is just an open forum where I ask you to put out ideas and criticisms of the course that I can incorporate into future course offerings. And then in week 16, your extended abstract will be due on Wednesday, April 25th. On the discussion board, there's a typo in the syllabus on the due date for that. It refers to a date in December, and certainly that's a carryover from a previous syllabus, so I apologize for that. So Wednesday, April 25th, post this thing I call the extended abstract. What do I mean by that? I mean an abstract of about 500 words or so. I describe it on Canvas. But the intent of that is for you to write an abstract of not just the reading, but some ideas that you picked up on from the reading and what other scholars have to say about this. And the goal is for each of us to inform others, because some of you read the same works, and so that's going to be interesting. But some of you read quite different works, and I think it's important for everyone to see the literature that's out there. And then, of course, the final project, your scholarly book review, is due to me on Thursday, May 3rd, that being the Thursday of finals week. So something to keep in mind there. Graduation day is May 4th, Friday. I cannot accept any late work after midnight on that date, just because I only have a few days to post grades. I am given a hard deadline on posting grades. So it's really important for you to get that scholarly book review completed and turned in on time. Okay, so where are we going this week? First of all, I give you some literature that if you look at it, it sort of seems connected and it doesn't seem connected. And I'm going to get to that in a second, why I gave you the literature I did. But the first thing I really want to do is put this era in context that the literature finds itself in. So most of the literature is from the early 1990s or a little bit before. And that's an important period in world history, really, but particularly in administrative history. You know, the end of the Cold War ended around 1991 when the Soviet Union fell apart. A scholar named Francis Fukuyama wrote in 1989 about the end of history. In 1989, the Berlin Wall fell, in addition to being the year Taylor Swift was born, as in her album. But the Berlin Wall fell. If Fukuyama said this is the end of an ideological struggle, the struggle between Western liberalism and totalitarian ideologies. Later, uh, among other people, scholar Stanley Lee in 2014 noted that Fukuyama was really wrong. Western ideology has certainly not triumphed um, completely over a lot of other ideologies. Um, and there is still an ideological struggle going on, not only with Russian ideas, perhaps, but with other ideas that we will continue to struggle with ideologically. Um, Also, during this period, in the 1980s and 1990s, we started to see this huge mistrust of so-called big government and the welfare state, particularly in the United States, in the UK, and elsewhere. The notion that government is unable to solve the problems of society, that President Reagan and Prime Minister Thatcher promoted the privatization of government. It went a lot farther in the UK. Um, the ideas of new public management and reinventing government. And so into this sort of environment came these Virginia Tech scholars and others who wrote what is called the Blacksburg Manifesto. And I also put in here this article by Salomon called The Rise of the Nonprofit Sector because it's in context. So let me get to some of that context now. So Salomon, let me talk about the notes on the readings too. Salomon wrote in 2002 this work called The Tools of Government. Something I also include for you on Canvas for this week is an interview with Lester Salomon, which is really a good interview. And so please take the time to watch those YouTube videos from that interview because Professor Salomon does a really good job of explaining what he means by the tools of government. For the reading itself, it seems a little thick, so here's some things I really want you to pay attention to. Pay attention to the table of contents for the book. The titles of the chapters themselves give you a pretty good idea of what Salomon's thesis is. Chapter 1, I want you to really look at the tables. The tables provide you with an idea of how governments carry out programs. So keeping in mind that Salomon's research was based on a cross-section, 1999, of the federal budget. But the tables give you a pretty good idea of, again, what he's talking about. And governments provide services through a variety of tools. That's really what Salomon's talking about. Not simply or even primarily through direct government. And the choice of tools really often depends on the purpose of the service being delivered. So that's the Salomon work on the tools of government. The Bryson work, 2014, talks about public value governance. So I give you this work because it really is something of a bridge. It's a transitory stage, really, between new public management and something called new public service, which you're going to read about in week 14. So keep that in mind as you read what Bryson has to say. So this is really the kind of the boiled down version of what Salomon has to say. So 1999, this 1 year cross section of federal government activity, this is what Salomon finds. If you look at the amount in billions of dollars in the left-hand column and the percentage in the right-hand column, you get an idea. What he calls direct government, that is the government at the federal level providing goods and services directly through some government organization, was about 28% of all the activity, 28% of all the budget. So that means that somewhere around 70% of government activity was not provided through government itself. It was provided through other tools, such as contracting, grants, vouchers, tax expenditures, loan guarantees, deposit insurance. So the point is that In fact, the federal government is quite big. It's quite large. Um, but most of it, and this still holds true today, most of it really is not supporting large government organizations that directly provide services to taxpayers. That's really the boiled down version of what Solomon is saying in this article, but it's good to look at the tables that he has. So here's really the heart of what I wanted you to read this week. It's called Public Administration and the Governance Process. It's also known as the Blacksburg Manifesto because most of the people who were involved in writing it worked at the university, Virginia Tech University, which is in Blacksburg, Virginia. It was included in a 1990 publication, but it was really originally written in 1983, and it makes the case for what Walmsley calls the public administration. He keeps saying that, the public administration. Not just public administration, but the public administration, as if he's comparing it to the Senate, the House of Representatives, the presidency, the Supreme Court. That's really what you should take from that. What he says is the problem of governing a modern republic with a commitment to freedom and justice on one hand, and a commitment to a complex mixture of capitalism and state intervention on the other. That's the problem that we have. So what they're really saying is that at the same time where we support our Constitution, which does have a commitment to limited government, that's on one hand, but we have all these commitments that government has made on the other hand. And so we have a bureaucracy that supports that. And so how do we balance that? Well, what they're saying is we don't really always do such a great job of balancing that. And this statement that political leaders have increasingly used the word bureaucracy as an epithet. Presidents of both parties have made attacks on it as the centerpiece of their campaigns, only to find that this tactic, so useful in getting elected, becomes a self-inflicted wound in the subsequent struggle to govern. Okay, so think about this. They wrote this in the 1980s. So this sort of use of the word bureaucracy has not ceased necessarily from the 1980s when this was written. So what Walmsley et al. Talk about, what they do to make their case is that, first of all, they talk about mythologies. They talk about the distinctive character of PA, and they try to demonstrate the value of public administration to society. First of all, what they say is that there are mythologies about the public sector, that it actually is not. It's not this thing that really destroys our freedom. That's what they argue. Now, you can argue the other way, but they're arguing that it doesn't. It shouldn't be denigrated for short-term partisan gain. They make that argument. They say that public administration, which is not a business, has a distinctive character. They argue for what they call an agency perspective. An agency perspective, what is that? That's specialized knowledge, historical experience, time-tested wisdom, and a degree of consensus regarding the public interest relevant to that particular function. So therefore, a really good example of an agency perspective is what more than one president has said, that when it comes to fighting wars, the president wants to trust the commanders in the field. For sure, more than one president has said that. More than one party of presidents has said that. So what are they really saying by that? What they're saying by that is that the generals in the Department of Defense have a particular agency perspective, that they have a particular specialized knowledge, that they have particular historical experience, time-tested wisdom, and degree of consensus regarding the public interest relevant to that particular social function, which happens to be fighting wars. So the logical question is, If generals in the Department of Defense have that kind of specialized knowledge, do not also scientists in the Environmental Protection Agency have that kind of knowledge? Do not also rangers in the Forest Service have that kind of knowledge? Do not also even IRS agents, experts in taxation, have that kind of knowledge? Now, what I am not doing here is I'm not advocating for government malfeasance. I'm also not advocating for the idea that just because someone works in a particular function, you should listen to them uncritically. And I don't think Walmsley's making that case either. But what he is saying is that if you have persons of integrity and persons of knowledge and training in agencies, that what they do bring to the table is some specialized knowledge and historical experience. Of course, it is always up to Congress to control the funding for any agency, and also to control really the policy priority of any agency. And I don't think Walmsley is arguing that Congress can't do that, but they are arguing that people in agencies do bring something of value to the table. And that is a pursuit of the public interest in terms of what that agency delivers. The other argument that Walmsley makes is that all of this is grounded in a constitutional governance process. There is, in fact, a politics administration dichotomy that exists at some levels, but on other levels, it really doesn't exist. And where it doesn't exist, and this is what Walmsley's saying, is that elected officials, it would be better for them to actually listen to the specialized knowledge, historical experience, and time-tested wisdom of people that work in government agencies when it comes to creating policy. That it would be useful for not just the agency, but for the public interest to listen to those people. So in a sense, you are involving administrators in politics, and that is at least the policy-making part of politics. So Walmsley et al. Make some other really interesting assertions, and I think these are important. They talk about PA and capitalism. What they assert is that our economy is a mixed economy, that both capitalism and administration have played a role. I would assert that that's true as well. And I go back to, personally, I kind of go back to ideas like the Transcontinental Railroad, which really was supported by the federal government. The Union Pacific would not exist without the Trans-Pacific Railway Act. I go back to the creation of the Department of Agriculture. I go back to the Homestead Act. Things like this where really I think the federal government made an agreement with states and with the population that at least part of the economy would be advocated by the federal government, would be supported by the federal government. But that agreement made essentially a public-private partnership. Again, you're free to disagree with that, but I think this is the case that Walmsley is making. They also assert that the founders did anticipate administration, particularly in the Federalist Papers. They didn't fully think it through, but in fact, it's not accurate to say that administration was completely ignored in the Constitution. That word doesn't appear in the document itself, but the word itself certainly appears all over the Federalist Papers. And what the Federalist Papers really describe is what the writers of the Constitution were thinking about. Okay, so let me switch off that because I gave you this other reading, which seems out of place. I realize it was written in 1994, so it's more than 20 years old. So the question is this quaint? Because when Solomon wrote this article, nonprofits weren't even of the scale that they are today. But here's what I think is important about this work in 1994. Um, again, going back to the historical context. Going back to the historical context, um, at the end of the Cold War, it appeared that the ideological struggle was over, even though it wasn't. But it also appeared that we had a lot of post-colonial states um, that were there, had been there for decades, but we actually started paying more attention to them at the end of the Cold War, um, where it was very clear that constituted governments didn't necessarily work in the way that they were supposed to. And so Salomon theorized this idea that there's this third sector. Um, and he said there's a rise in associations, um, which is interesting because around the same time, Putnam wrote this book called Bullying Alone, where he said people were associating less with each other. They're kind of talking about two different things. What Solomon's talking about is on the international arena that groups are starting to associate together to take on the role that would be normally part of government. So on page 109, he says the upshot is that there's a global third sector, a massive array of self-governing private organizations not dedicated to distributing profits to shareholders or directors, pursuing public purposes outside the formal apparatus of the state, and that the proliferation, easy for me to say, of these groups may be permanently altering the relationship between states and citizens with an impact extending far beyond the material services they provide. So think about this. In many states, particularly a lot of post-colonial states, it is the NGOs who are doing jobs that we have seen governments do in the Western world. The bigger question, though, is as nonprofits continue to grow in the United States, in the Western world, how do we start defining the relationship between what we have called the public sector and the nonprofit sector and the for-profit sector if there is this third sector that isn't government and isn't for profit? So from Solomon's perspective, how did this happen? So I talked about some of this. Um, what he says was that we saw this crisis in the welfare state in the West, that we started to see in the West that there was less trust in it because it appeared the welfare state was crowding out private investment. We saw this crisis of development in developing countries, that poverty really in the developing and post-colonial countries was pervasive. We saw a global environmental crisis, and we still see it, really. Um, and remember, Salomon wrote this before the Kyoto or Paris environmental treaties or concerned with carbon emissions as we know them. And now we're still talking about Kyoto and Paris. And he says there's a crisis of socialism, that socialism, like capitalism, didn't fully deliver. And, you know, Soviet style socialism certainly didn't deliver at all. It actually was kind of a papered over form of totalitarianism. And so we had all this in context in the early 1990s, all of these things happening at once. So where does that leave us? Um, it leaves us here, I think. Governance is not only done by governments. So this is a good point in this lecture to kind of look at what Bryson's talking about. That government is sometimes a conveyor. It's a catalyst, a collaborator. Sometimes it's steering, sometimes it's rowing, sometimes it's partnering, sometimes it's staying out of the way. This is what Bryson has to say. That government doesn't deliver services through some big government takeover all the time, but rather often does so by making use of existing capability within all sectors. So, if you have a student loan, you probably didn't get that student loan from the government. You probably got it from a bank. If you have a guaranteed mortgage loan on your house, such as a VA loan, you did not get that from the VA. The VA guarantees it. Many people continue to push for vouchers in public schools, to send kids to charter or private schools. This remains controversial in a lot of states. But the point of that, however you feel about it, is that it would become a de facto way of government delivering a service. So Solomon, again, talks about all these tools in his other reading, the tools of government. And the point that he's making is that, in fact, government service delivery itself is done through a combination of work in three sectors, at least three sectors. So here's where I talk about what I want you to do in the discussion this week. We have those 3 short videos by Lester Solomon. Those are good. That's a good interview. So please take the time to watch that. Here's what I want you to talk about in the discussion this week. Bryson talks about public value governments. Walmsley talks about refounding. We talked about the third sector, the rise of the nonprofit sector, albeit that article was written 24 years ago. Here's what I'd like you to do for this discussion. I'd like you to envision yourself in about a decade. And I'd like you to think about the education you're getting as an MPA student. And if we accept that walls that separated sectors, that is public sector, nonprofit sector, for-profit sector, have now been permeated or being permeated more all the time, what is the role of public administrators in the future? Specifically, how would you, as a public administrator, add value to the governance of the city and the region in which you work? So this is a think piece for this week, and it leads into the journal that I'll ask you to do in a couple of weeks. But give this some thought. And I should just note here, I really have enjoyed the thought that most of you have put into the discussion board every week. It's been really, really very thoughtful, and I think I've learned a lot from reading what you guys have written. I hope you have as well. So that's it. I look forward to reading your discussions this week. Thanks.